Thank you, Candace, and thank you all for coming here this evening. This is really a great series that CalTrout has put on to educate people about water issues. Water issues are a lot on our minds, either because of droughts or because of excessive rain and dams and reservoirs overflowing. So this is a timely series. What I am going to do tonight, what Candace asked me to do, was to talk a little bit about the development of the Southern California Steelhead Recovery Plan that NOAA put out in 2012, and then relate that to the Santa Clara River watershed and how the Santa Clara River watershed sort of fits into that overall plan. So I'm going to begin with some background. Some of this stuff is a little bit wonky, but that's just the nature of it, and hopefully we'll get to some more interesting and locally related issues a little further on in the talk. So go ahead. So just to start with the basics, the National Marine Fisheries Service listed Southern California steelhead as endangered in 1997. Originally, the listing extended from the Santa Maria River in the north down to the Malibu coast in the south. Then we discovered some additional populations further south, and we extended the listing from Santa Monica Mountains south to the U.S.-Mexico border. And this map basically depicts the boundaries of what we call, it's a first abbreviation, distinct population segment. That's what's listed under the Endangered Species Act. So you can see it extends from the Santa Maria River in the south to the Tijuana River, in the north, to the Tijuana River in the south. Next. So this whole process began in earnest around 2000, 3 years after the fish were listed, when the National Marine Fisheries Service convened a bunch of scientists to lay the groundwork for the recovery plan. And this process went on from 2000 till about 2008 or so. And after that, I sort of got involved in the putting together of the plan itself with a lot of help from stakeholders and also other folks that are interested in this fish. So this is a group of scientists that we convened. There was 12 of them. And they had a lot of different kinds of backgrounds. Some were physical scientists, some were biologists, some were statisticians, and some were geneticists. So we spent a lot of time, they spent a lot of time trying to develop the science and the foundation for the plan. Next. So they published all this work in a series of technical memorandum. This is just 3 of the main ones, but there were 6 or 7, and they're all scientifically peer-reviewed. They're online, available for people to look at the work in detail. So next. So I want to compress 7 years of work into like 4 simple slides to give you some idea what came out of this process, what sorts of findings they came to. Bear in mind, when they started this process, not much was known about Southern California steelhead. A lot of it was anecdotal, but there had not been any real scientific investigation of the species. So they kind of started from scratch, assuming nothing, and tried to develop a foundation that was based actually on sound science. So a couple of basic things. They found that the fish were historically distributed throughout the coastal watersheds. A lot of people thought the fish weren't actually in some of these watersheds, but looking at the record, they found that in fact that they were. They also found, based on field work, that they continue to be distributed widely throughout the Southern California region. Next. But they had been eliminated from about 1/3 of the watersheds, and they were severely depressed in all of the watersheds, without exception. Hence, the listing of the fish as an endangered species. Next. So some of the more sort of wonky scientific stuff. In the work that the TRT did, the technical review team, they found that while these populations had been split or divided by all kinds of barriers, including dams. The fish above and the fish below still remain very closely related to each other genetically, more closely related to each other in the same watershed than to fish in adjacent watersheds. So one of the things that came out of that was this realization that the fish above these dams, which no longer go to the ocean and come back as steelhead, they live their entire lives in fresh water, are in fact not descended from hatchery-reared fish, but in fact originally from native steelhead. Now, we've done a lot of work since this original work was done, more genetic work that confirms this basic pattern, but it's also shown that the further south you go, the more these fish that are above these barriers differ from the fish that are below the barriers and that still have access to the ocean. Nevertheless, these populations further south do contain, in certain isolated pockets, remnant original steelhead genetics. Next. So this is just an image from one of these more recent studies that shows the area that we're from, and these purple squares are these populations that were examined to determine what their genetic background was, and all these fish basically are originally native fish. But if you go further south, and I'm not going to do that here, you can see that there are fewer purple dots, and there are other kinds of dots and circles that show where there's been a mixing of hatchery-reared fish with native steelhead. Next. So another result from this is that the way the technical recovery team and NIMS looks at these two isolated populations is that they are in fact the native steelhead and the landlocked native rainbow trout are an integral population. They really aren't separated in fact, even though they are physically by current barriers. And one of the things that we have found is that these sea-run fish will interbreed with the native landlocked fish when they have an opportunity. When these younger fish or smaller fish, say, wash over a dam into anadromous waters and encounter sea-run fish, they have no problem interbreeding. The other thing is that these fish that might have been derived from a landlocked population that had never been to the ocean can themselves produce progeny or themselves continue to complete their life cycle by passing to the ocean and then returning as adult steelhead. So what that means, among other things, is that we have in these watersheds, virtually all these watersheds, we have native seed stock of steelhead that have been blocked from expressing their anadromous life cycle, but can do so and would do so if the physical barrier separating these populations can be removed or can be modified. Next. So another thing that came out of this work that was done by the TRT was a much more complex picture of the life cycle of these fish. To sum it up very simply, they aren't all doing the same things at the same time. They're all doing a bunch of different things. You've all seen this sort of circle of life cycle of these fish, salmon and steelhead, and it's kind of a simple pattern. Well, these fish aren't going in circles. The circles are going in circles. And so this graph kind of captures in a graphic way the interaction between the freshwater fish, the fish in the estuaries, the brackish water fish, and the fish in the marine environment. So some fish may lead a classic anadromous life or exhibit a classic life cycle, anadromous life cycle. Others, even if they can pass to the ocean, do not and live out their entire lives, including breed in fresh water. And then you have fish that do a bunch of things in in between that pass back and forth between the marine and the brackish and the freshwater. And Ethan may say more about this when he talks about estuaries later on. And I'll touch on it just a bit more, but enough here other than to emphasize that we found that these fish have variable life histories and they're very complex. And that's one of the keys to their persisting in a very dynamic environment. Next. So when the technical recovery team began to do their work, before that, the National Marine Fisheries Service developed a conceptual framework that all this work goes into, in which they try to kind of organize a bunch of different kinds of information about the fish and about their populations into some basic categories for the purpose of defining what exactly is a viable steelhead population. That's critical because the fish are listed as endangered because they're not viable, but you need to know what would they look like if they were viable so that they can be delisted. So there's four basic things here. The most obvious one is abundance. You have to have some number of them. 2 or a dozen isn't abundant, and that's not going to be viable. They have to be able to reproduce, obviously, so be biologically productive. Now, the last two are a little more subtle. This population has to show some biological diversity, and that's probably the central key in the recovery plan: preserving, restoring biological diversity at a number of different levels: at a population level, at an individual level, at a genetic level, at a behavioral level, so that all these fish aren't clones or don't all act like they're just copying each other. That's a sure path to their destruction. And then closely related to this diversity is this spatial distribution. This is also key, and it's not really obvious to people who kind of think of steelhead in terms of classic steelhead habitat. These fish were, as we discovered, initially very broadly distributed spatially, and that spatial distribution subjected them to a whole range of selective pressures, which expressed itself biologically in this biological diversity. So maintaining this spatial distribution is really key to maintaining this biological diversity. And this is the key not only to the survival of steelhead, but basically every other organism. Next. So starting to translate the science into recovery planning talk. There were some goals that they identified, the TRT. One was to preserve this overall diversity at these various levels, to protect the species from catastrophic disturbances, which are a natural part of the regime, that is wildfires, flooding, droughts, and so on. And this is done through the spatial distribution. We're not trying to prevent flooding or droughts or natural wildfires. That's part of the landscape. But if they're distributed across the entire landscape, where these occur in individual watersheds, doesn't mean that the whole species would be affected and driven to extinction. And then this whole framework is in a 1,000-year time frame. In other words, we have to convince ourselves that these fish will be able to persist once they're restored for a very long time. It's hard for people to kind of relate to this. I mean, we barely survive from one election cycle to another, but the ESA is based on science, not politics. So we need a reasonable time frame that these fish would persist over. Next. So, and this kind of overlaps here, but the basic strategy in achieving those goals is to restore these populations in representative, more jargon, diverse biogeographic regions. This is the spatial part right here. And to deal with the natural catastrophic events that they're subject to restore multiple populations throughout those geographic regions, so that if one population is subjected to some kind of catastrophic event in a particular region, it doesn't mean all the populations in that region are extirpated. Next. Okay, so trying to tie this together. This is the same Southern California DPS from the Santa Maria River to the Tijuana. And the technical recovery group broke this large area into what are called biogeographic population groups. That's a mouthful. I just call them BPGs. And there's 5 of them. Let me step aside here. So this is the biggest one here. This is Monte Rito. This is the Conception Coast. This is the Santa Monica Mountains. This is the Mojave Rim, because it extends actually all the way to the Anza-Borrego Desert. And then we have the Catalina South Coast biogeographic region. And if you think about this map a little bit, without getting too technical about it, you can see that there's some sort of self-evident differences between these regions in terms of the geography, in terms of the geology, in terms of the vegetation, in terms of the hydrology, the rainfall, and runoff patterns. So the TRT has captured this diversity in this way, and they're using this as a framework then to develop a recovery strategy that makes it, that ensures that the selective regimes in each one of these will continue to drive the biological diversity of the species as a whole in this DPS. Next. Okay, so one of the things that came out of this process was the development of viability criteria. This ESU stands for the original term that was used, evolutionary significant unit. The DPS is distinct population segment. Because recovery plans are not regulatory documents, we actually use the ESU terminology throughout the recovery plan because it's sort of more biologically meaningful. It's rooted in evolutionary principles. So these populations have to have a minimum number in each biogeographic region, those 5 that I showed you. Those watersheds have to provide some kind of drought refugia, and there has to be a minimum separation in those watersheds. Now, obviously, we're not moving the watersheds around. We're picking the watersheds so that they're separated by a minimum distance, about 61 kilometers. And that was based on a fire frequency analysis that we did between 1916 and 2010 or something like that, 2010. So we looked at the pattern of fires and we figured out how big they would be and how many streams you'd have to have in each biogeographic region. So statistically, all of the streams in each biogeographic region wouldn't be subjected to a catastrophic wildfire event, which is, next to plate tectonics, probably the single biggest natural physical driver in these watersheds. These are all chaparral fire-dependent watersheds. So fire is to these watersheds what water is to the Olympic Peninsula. You couldn't have an Olympic Peninsula without water, and you couldn't have these systems without fire constantly renewing these watersheds. But it's, it's a tricky business if you're trying to make a living in one of these watersheds and you have all of your eggs in one watershed. Next. So these are some numbers that were developed provisionally as standards to be used to determine the viability of populations. We came up with a run size, an extinction rate over 100 years. This applies to individual populations, not the 1,000 years for the whole DPS. Persistence over changing conditions in the ocean. And we're assuming, for the purposes of this plan, that all the fish that we're counting in that number up there are anadromous fish, sea-run fish. And there's less than 5% hatchery influence. So a couple of things about these population viability criteria. First of all, this is provisional. I can't go into the details, but we need to refine this, not just in terms of the absolute number, but also in terms of how we look at watersheds that may act collectively as metapopulations. So the numbers reach not by fish in one watershed, but by multiple watersheds. It gets a little bit complicated talking about all that. Just know that that's a provisional number. I mean, we can tell you how it's derived. It was very rigorous the way it was done. And it's probably not a bad number for some of the larger systems in this DPS, like the Santa Clara or the Ventura or the Santa Clara, where we know that their numbers were higher than that historically. But we have smaller watersheds that function differently, not just here, but also in other parts of the state as well. And we are assuming, and this is a big assumption, that these fish that we're counting are all steelhead, but we know that in fact they may not all be. They may be offspring of a resident and an anadromous fish, and yet still contribute to the viability of the population because, as I said earlier a bit ago, we consider the resident and the anadromous form to be integral components of a single population. Next. So we put out this plan in 2002. It's a very big document. It's about 600 pages. I'm not going to go through all of it. We did, among other things, a threats assessment for each watershed, tried to determine what were the things that were causing the population to be depressed. We displayed this in the plan in these little summary sheets where the rivers are, this is the BPG that we're in. The rivers are across the top, the threat sources are down here. There's a whole series of workbooks that are many, probably thousands of pages that lie behind the chart. The chart's just a summary. But it's a useful sort of planning tool to get some idea of where the hot spots are for problems. Next. Okay, so now we're going to zero in on the Santa Clara. I don't think I used the term, but that BPG that we're in is called Monte Arito Highlands. It's named after a mountain in the backcountry that most of you have never heard of, but it sheds water in all directions and it feeds all four of the populations that are in this one BPG, the Santa Ynez, the Santa Maria, the Santa Clara, and the Ventura River. Okay, so that's the BPG that the Santa Clara sits in the middle of, and this 4 is the number, the minimum number of watersheds that must be restored in that BPG to meet our DPS viability criteria. Next. So this is the Santa Clara River watershed. Most of you probably know some basic things about it. It's a pretty big watershed. It's about 1,700 square miles. It has about 2,500 miles of stream channels in it. There are about 360,000 people who live in this watershed, most of them down here. About half of it is publicly owned, and about 80% of it is actually in open space, either national forest or some other form of undeveloped open space. What this map is, and you can't really see a lot of the text here, is a map of what we call intrinsic potential spawning and verving habitat. We did this analysis for every watershed to determine what was its intrinsic potential to support a viable run of steelhead. And we mapped those areas of the watersheds that have a higher or lower intrinsic potential. And that's what all these colors are about. What I would draw your attention to is this statistic right here, which is showing you that of that 2,500 total stream habitat, about 1,500, which is above Freeman, contains the majority of the spawning and rearing habitat. It's not that there isn't spawning and rearing habitat in the main stem, but the majority of it is located in these tributaries above the Vern Freeman diversion on the main stem of the Santa Clara. Next. So This is just kind of a quick tour of the watershed, and then we'll talk a little bit about some recovery actions and some other related issues. Starting at the mouth, this is the Santa Clara River estuary. It's really a fraction of its former self because of encroachment from both state parks and the city of Ventura and agriculture. Still, it's a big estuary with a lot of water, and it does have rearing potential. Next. So this is what the main stem looks like, which is one of the reasons that it's not the primary spawning and marine habitat. It's a low gradient, shallow stream. It warms up because of the slow water movement. It can have low dissolved oxygen, although there are parts along the main stem where the water conditions are a little different because of the geology further up north. But this is pretty upstream, that would be east. But this is pretty typical of the lower main stem. Next. So I've mentioned these tributaries that are productive, and here too. This is Santa Paula Creek. And Cesar Creek, which is a tributary to Santa Paula Creek. These are really highly productive spawning in marine habitats. You can see the obvious difference between the main stem and these tributaries, and you could sum it up in one word: complexity. This is obviously a much more complex physical environment than the main stem. And that, again, relates to this whole business of diversity. Next. This is sort of the heart of the steelhead spawning habitat. This is all, of course, above the Vern Freeman, and we'll talk about that in a second. There are deep pools here that provide oversummering habitat. When water flows actually get very low, sometimes go subsurface, these pools are fed by groundwater. There's good, clear, cold water that fish can make it over the summer and in extended drought periods as well. And it's stable because it's these large bedded massive formations of rock that keep these pools persistent decade after decade, probably thousands of years. Next. So going a little further north, the topography changes, and it looks a lot like this, but then there's places like the upper gorge that has pools that are similar to the lower gorge, not as extensive. Again, this is all contributing to the diversity of the selective pressures, which drives the diversity of the species. Fish that hang out here or there or downstream are going to be subject to a different kind of environment, depending on how they're made up, what their genetic makeup is. They're going to do better or worse. But overall, you've got a very complex selective regime when you look at the watershed, the main stem, and the tributaries as a whole. Next. So everyone has heard about the steelhead of the Santa Clara and the Sesame Creek, so I just thought I'd throw in a few pictures just for the fun of it. This is 1911. This is a little bit later when the city of Ventura and Oxnard were booming, and there were a lot more fishermen taking fish. These were all taken at the mouth. Next. The Forest Service put out maps in the early 1920s, and of course they featured angling opportunities in all the maps. And this is just an excerpt from what was then called the Santa Barbara National Forest. It was a national forest, but hadn't been combined together to make what we now know is the Los Padres National Forest. And this is a photo in downtown Ventura, just up the street here, at Schaefer's Sporting Goods store. They had an annual steelhead contest, and this guy, Ron, won it that year. So he got his picture in the paper. Fish continued to run up the Santa Clara and the Sespe, and I just got this photograph just a day ago, thanks to Alistair and a friend, from Bruce Vincent, who made this annual trip, like I've made for decades, which were purely fishing trips. And you can see he's got some fresh run fish that came out of the ocean. These are smaller than the fish back in the 40s, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Can't go into that, but fish are sensitive to the modifications in the flow regime and passage opportunities that they've experienced in the last 30 or 40 years in the Santa Clara. This is also in the gorge. This is actually close to that first photo I showed you of the gorge. Next. So this is lower Piru Creek, just below Santa Felicia Dam. This is another major spawning tributary. It might have had actually more absolute habitat than the Sesame because it's got more major tributaries than the Sesame, but it's been cut off by a series of dams, Santa Felicia and an upstream pyramid. These are releases, by the way, that NIMS secured out of Santa Felicia through a biological opinion that we wrote a few years ago. Otherwise, it would not have any flow in it right now. Next. So going up above Santa Felicia Dam, this is the kind of habitat you see. This is Middle Piru Creek. This is Agua Blanca, which is a tributary to it. And you can see that these are unregulated flows for the most part. And this was after the 2005 event, so the dam above was spilling. And it creates these large gravel bars, which is material that's used for the spawning habitat in the channel. Next. So I want to kind of pivot a little bit and talk a little bit more about some of the constraints to recovery. I've already mentioned access and passage. There's also degradation of in-stream riparian habitat as a result of not just encroachment and flood control structures like levees, but also sand and gravel mining operations. And then, of course, we have these persistent wildfires, which have been exacerbated, and the loss of estuarine habitat. This is probably the most sort of well-studied or best recognized loss because people have been concerned about estuarine loss for a very long time. It's one of the things that helped precipitate the creation of the California Coastal Act, the loss of estuarine habitat, particularly in Southern California. Next. So I've mentioned Vern Freeman. This is the dam. It's used to divert water from the Santa Clara into a set of spreading grounds, which then are used to maintain groundwater basins where water is pumped out. Upstream, there's on Piru Creek, there's another diversion and a smaller set of spreading ponds that are used to recharge groundwater. There was a fish passage facility built in connection with this, but it has not functioned the way it had been intended, and we're under discussions on what to do about that. I can't really get into the details on that right now. But the thing to note about it is this is low down in the system. This is the choke point in the system. The fish can't get above this. They can't get to all the spawning habitat that's above that, which is the majority of it. So it's the linchpin to the Santa Clara steelhead fishery. Next. Couple of more shots. This is looking downstream. So you see there's a drop, and then the sediment is all accumulated on the upstream side. We're still getting, and this relates to the first couple of slides I showed you, we're still getting smolts coming out of the tributaries. They can get over obstacles, and then they get trapped and mechanically, in the past, moved down to the estuary. So the upstream habitat is still producing fish that are not anadromous in origin, but which are trying to resume a anadromous life cycle. And that's important because I said these are the sort of the natural seed stock in this watershed and others as well. Next. So on Santa Paula Creek, there's a couple of things. Harvey Dam has been there for a very, very long time. There was a fish ladder put in many decades ago. That was upgraded just about a decade ago, maybe. Neither has ever worked effectively because it's very hard to operate a fish ladder in a very flashy stream like this with a tremendous sediment load. Everything from fine silts to boulders the size of Volkswagens. So this fish passage facility, as much as step weirs, was put in as a transition between the lower Santa Paula flood control project, basically two levees, and the upstream area because of the gradient. It lasted just a couple of years before we had this 2000, I think it was 2005 flood. And it just simply, I mean, it's just like they went in with a wrecking crew and a wrecking ball and just tore it up. So it's non-functional, and the whole idea of trying to put something in an active channel like this and then maintain it, highly problematic. Next. So I've mentioned a couple of these reservoirs, but there's actually 4 here that affect the Santa Clara River system. The Bouquet and Castaic reservoirs are in the upper watershed. The Pyramid and Piru are in the Piru Creek drainage. We have issued a biological opinion for this operation, which has resulted in those flows that I showed you. But we're also working on getting fish around this, and we're working on plans with the United Water Conservation District to implement those. And we've just started negotiations with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that controls this state water project facility to get flows and ultimately passage around that reservoir so that we can open up someday the whole of the Piru Creek drainage, which is a very, very substantial drainage in the Santa Clara River Basin. Next. So this is Santa Felicia Dam. These are some smolts that came over the dam when this dam spilled naturally. There was fish upstream trying to get out. They may not have been trying to get over that dam. They got washed over the dam. But they were then picked up downstream, demonstrating that, you know, there are fish above. They are getting over the dam one way or another, and they are apparently trying to move on down to the ocean. So they're trying to keep this system going in some fashion. Next. So another big issue besides these dams is the groundwater basins in the Santa Clara River, particularly the lower Santa Clara River, that affects the connectivity between the estuary and the upstream tributaries. This has one of the deepest aquifers anywhere in the state, and it is just really huge. And it supports a $1 billion plus ag industry, aided by the Vern Freeman diversion and the percolation of that diverted water into the Oxnard Plain. Just, I visit 2 years ago, maybe 3, it was right in the middle of the drought. California passed the California Groundwater Sustainability Act, which has the potential to revolutionize groundwater management, because in the past, groundwater management has not been managed and regulated in the same way that surface flows. There just wasn't any legal framework for doing that. Well, the Groundwater Sustainability Act created that framework, and it identified a whole series of groundwater basins throughout the state where groundwater management agencies are required to develop a sustainable groundwater management plan. And sustainable includes, really for the first time, sustaining in-stream beneficial uses, riparian habitats, fish habitats, recreational habitats in a sustainable way. So it's plugged in. And the Santa Clara River Basin has 2 agencies that are obligated to comply with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. That's the Fox Canyon Aquifer Groundwater Management Agency, which is sort of in the lower main stem, and then the Piru Groundwater Management Agency, which is in the Piru area. So these are really important sort of planning opportunities to plug in not just steelhead, but all the other in-stream beneficial uses that have not been recognized in the past in managing groundwater basins. And you probably know that most of the water supplied to the state of California, all of its uses, actually comes out of the ground. Lakes are, you think about a map, lakes are these little blue dots, right? But under those blue dots and extending out beyond the map is all the groundwater basin. That's where the majority of the water that we use, the agriculture use, comes from. So managing that fraction of the water supply is really, really important, which is why the Groundwater Management Sustainability Act was so important, and hopefully will take us into the 21st century in managing water. Next. So switching gears a little bit, this is a big watershed, as I mentioned, and it produces a lot of water when it rains. Here's Santa Barbara Airport in 2005. Some of you might have remembered this. It goes from a little trickle to 100,000 CSF in a couple of hours. And if you're built in the floodplain like the airport is, chances are you're going to get flooded. If not overtopped, eroded, because this river is trying to meander, as you can kind of see this. It doesn't go in a straight line. And further upstream is Hopper Creek. It's a very small, sort of nondescript. You maybe not even notice it when you drive over it. But this year, in 2005, you would notice it because it comes out of a extremely steep watershed. You can see it there in the background, and it's a very short run from there to the confluence of the Santa Clara. So this water is running downhill like this, not like this, but like this. And so it picks up a lot of debris, a lot of large woody debris, and then this was all caught up on an old defunct railroad bridge right near the confluence, right on the west side of Highway 126. Next. So some more flood issues. This is lower Santa Paula Creek. When Santa Paula Creek reaches the Santa Clara River, it's at its lowest gradient, and so its velocity is the slowest. And because of that, it doesn't have the same capacity to carry the sediment that's been eroded from the upper watershed. It drops it, creates a big, it's not just a floodplain, it's a delta where the Santa Paula Creek and the Santa Clara River reach, just like the delta, the mouth of the Nile. It just spreads out and you have multiple channels going in all directions. The city of Santa Barbara, or rather Santa Paula, is built on one edge of that delta, and that's been a problem. This is 1969, looking upstream at this railroad bridge, which is still here. Actually, I was looking downstream at the bridge, now I think about it. So this is just yesterday looking upstream at the same bridge. And what you can see they've tried to do is combine that spread out channel that's carrying not only water, but tremendous amounts of sediment, probably more sediment in a major flood than actual water. The water is just sort of the matrix in which the sediment is carried. And they're trying to confine it between these two hardened surfaces. The thought being that this would increase the velocity and therefore the efficiency of the channel to carry the same amount of water, which is probably true, but it doesn't really fully account for the sediment load, which is a whole different thing, because if this is still the lower gradient and it drops sediment, it fills this channel with sediment, leaving less volume in that channel to carry the flow itself. Next. Yep. Okay. So similar issue, this is Pole Creek. This is 2005 after the big flood. This is the flood control that was put in to support the Twin Bridges development. You can see what a change there is in the habitat. Next. More Pole Creek. This is above 126, the natural channel. This is how it looks when it drops into the lower reach on the downside of 126. Obviously, fish cannot get up here. Next. I mentioned sand and gravel operations. I'm not going to go into that. That's been, for the most part, largely controlled because the county was having real serious groundwater and flood control problems resulting from these massive sand and gravel operations, most of which are now off river, not in the channel. Next. So non-native species, this is a big issue in the middle reach of the Sespe. We have bass, catfish, and these all compete with the native steelhead and juvenile trout. Next. And one of the sources of this are these lakes up in Rose Valley. They fill up, people put fish in them, then they go fish for them, but then the lake overflows, the fish come over the spillway, and it runs into Howard Creek, and then Howard Creek into the Sespe, and it's a constant source of non-native fish. These structures, and there's two lakes and two different road crossings, also block fish passage upstream to over submarine refugia habitat below the Rose Valley Falls. So there's a passage issue there as well. Next. So fires, I mentioned this several times. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time other than just to point out that we've had, just in our own lifetime, some really massive fires, which is what drives the basic structure of our recovery plan. The Wolf Fire, the Piru Fire, and the Day Fire, the most recent. And as a result of these fires, go ahead, sorry. It changed the sediment loads, at least temporarily. So here's the Sespe in 2002, before the Wolf Fire. Here's a few years later, the same pool. There is no pool. You can just walk through it. So see the tremendous sediment loads, which is why fire, and of course this reduces the amount of steelhead marine spawning habitat, can eliminate it completely, why fire is such a big driver in the way we structured the recovery plan. Okay, it's what it is. Next. Same two pools, 2002, 2008. Now I'm just going to be finishing up with a few comments on the estuary. I've mentioned it already, so I don't need to say too much more. You might say something about your project there, right?
Yeah, I can touch on
okay.
some about
So I won't say anything other than the estuary is very important. There's work being done to see what we can do to enhance its natural productivity. Next. And this is just some example of the productivity. These are smolts that were inadvertently stranded in the estuary when it was artificially breached. They were rearing in the estuary. These would have gone to the ocean, fat and able to survive and come back as adults, but as a result of this breaching, they were all killed. So, go ahead. So I'm going to let Ethan talk more about estuaries. I'm not going to say anything about that. It's a really interesting story, though. So here are some of the, just to recap, some of the recovery, high priority recovery actions. Fish passage is number one. These are anadromous fish. They're highly migratory fish. They have to move above all else. They have to move. They can't just sit in a nice pool of water. They have to move from one place to another, which is why we put such a big emphasis on fish passage. Related, obviously, is flow management, and that involves the dams, surface diversions, groundwater extractions. And then flood control management, which relates to riparian corridors, and sediment management. And what we're getting at here is recognizing the role of sediment, just how fundamental it is to these fish. It's as important as the water, how it comes, when it comes. This is a real big problem in the Sespe, which is one of our major steelhead spawning habitats, and again, estuary restoration. This guy lost the contest in 1947, just so you know. I want to just say a last thing about our partners. I've talked mostly about what NIMS is doing, but actually, in addition to what we're doing, we have California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the California Coastal Conservancy that have been really, really involved heavily in the protection and the restoration of this watershed, not just for steelhead, but for all the other species. And then we have the NGOs, and I only have time for one slide in here, so I put up the Conservancy Santa Clara River project because these folks have done an amazing job They purchased over 3,500 acres of land along the Santa Clara River, putting the lower parts into semi-public ownership and trying to link the various pieces. But we've also got, working with the Nature Conservancy, obviously, the Friends of the Santa Clara River, the Santa Clara River Trustee Council, which has also purchased about 1,000 acres in the lower river. And we have the Keep Sespe Wild Group, which focuses on the Sespe, and of course, Cal Trout, which is doing work all over the watershed. So these partners are really, really critical to the work that we're doing. Next. So I'm not going to go into this other than to say that while we know a lot about these fish, there's a lot we don't know. And so research is a really big priority, as well as monitoring, because we actually don't know how many fish we have in any given year in virtually all of these watersheds. Next. So these are just some of the places where we're trying to do monitoring in Southern California. Topanga Creek is the southernmost where we have a life cycle monitoring station, but you can see it's only a handful of streams out of all the ones that we need to know a lot more about. This is a big job. We're just starting to work with the Department of Fish and Wildlife on a pilot program on the Ventura River and some other places a little bit further north. But at some point, after we've done all this recovery work, we want to know what's the result. You know, we have to be able to see whether we meet those viability criteria. Well, you can't do that unless you're monitoring. So the thus word is, I've talked about steelhead, but there's a lot more in this watershed. The way our recovery plan is structured, we focus on restoring natural processes, hydrologic processes, sediment processes, all the things that create all the habitats that all the other species really depend on. And there's a whole host of other federally listed species besides steelhead. At the mouth, of course, you have the tidewater goby, you have the royal toad. Further up north, upstream, we have another anadromous fish, the Pacific lamprey, which is not listed, but is now extremely rare in the Santa Clara River. So there's a lot of folks working on all of these issues besides us working on steelhead. And together, I think we have a pretty good chance of keeping this river going the way of so many others in Southern California. That's it. Thank you.
Here, obviously, a lot of interest. So I don't have information to tell you that's specific to the Santa Clara River, I'm sorry to say. But what Candace asked me to talk to you about was, what does it take? You know, that recovery plan kind of gives us the big picture, but how do we actually turn that into on-the-ground actions that's going to give us the kind of information that Mark's looking for? So what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about is how we actually go about doing this. So next. But before I start, I just always have to talk about the fact that while I get up to stand and tell the story, I only have a story to tell because of the so many wonderful people who have helped us along the way. And that includes Fish and Wildlife, National Marine Fisheries, and our incredible stream team volunteers, of which Candace was one in days past. But this kind of work is really time and labor intensive, and it doesn't happen with just the funding we get, because we never have enough funding to actually pay for it. So if we didn't have our volunteers to help with this work, I wouldn't have a story to tell you. So Mark kind of got into the overall picture. I just want to point out that, you know, this whole Southern California region is so interesting and unique from a steelhead point of view. I mean, think about what it takes to be an anadromous fish in Southern California. I mean, you've got to be some tough son of a gun to be able to do this, because you never know what the water or the flow is going to be. The water temperatures are extremely variable. You can't necessarily get into the creek where you were born, because that creek might not be open and accessible to you during the time you need to come. And we have no idea what they're doing when they go out in the ocean. So it's a really interesting place to be looking at what's going on with the fish. Just to kind of orient you to my little part of the world, we don't have like this massive watershed that you guys are dealing with. If you put all of our watersheds together, we still don't add up to the Santa Clara River watershed. But these small coastal drainages are really important because, as Mark pointed out, what you want is a lot of options and a lot of different opportunities so that the fish have a lot of choices in any given year. And that habitat, if they can't get in here, they can go there or to the next place. And one of the things that's really unique about southern steelhead is that they do that. They are not like our other salmonids that are tied to their natal stream. They like to go back to their natal stream, but if they can't get there, they don't just ignore the whole process. They'll go to other streams. So most of these little watersheds are somewhere between 10 and 18 square miles, so they're quite small. Malibu is the exception to that. Malibu is kind of interesting because it's what's called an antecedent creek. The creek was there before the mountains. And so it's the only watershed where the creek goes through the mountains and into the San Fernando Valley, which is why it's such a large watershed. Next. So you don't have to read all this. Mark put it up in a much simpler slide with those 4 characteristics. But to get to have the information to create a viable salmonid population estimate, you have to look at all of these different things. And so what we're talking about is the on-the-ground effort to do that. And as a result of this, you have tons of really cool questions to ask. And these are really thought-provoking. And what's interesting to me as a biologist who's been studying these fish now for about 17, 18 years, is that after all that time, months and months, getting to know these fish on a personal level, we still can't answer many of these questions. So how do we figure this out? One of the things that's really important that Mark talked about is abundance, right? We want to know how many fish there are. We want to know how many of those fish are anadromous adults who've been out to the ocean, grown big and strong, come back in and spawned. Maybe some of them have gone back out to the ocean and then come in another year to do it again. How many of them are stuck in the stream because they can't get out, as it's been the case for the past 4 years, where most of these fish were in isolated refugia pools, couldn't get to anywhere near the ocean because they couldn't even get downstream because there was no water, it was so dry. So how do we know what we've got? And so we use a variety of different tools, everything from these monthly on-the-ground snorkels, surveys, to tools where we actually catch the fish. We tag them, and then we put in different devices in the creek to count them as they swim by. All of these tools together are what we need. We can't just work on one thing only. We need all the pieces of the puzzle. To figure out the abundance is one thing, but as Mark pointed out, it's the spatial distribution of these fish that's also really critical. Where are they hanging out? What are the particular habitats that we really need to make sure critically stay in good shape? How do we find those? How do we make sure that they stay in good shape? And what can we do about that? And these are all maintained by all looking at things like the benthic invertebrates that provide the food for the fish, the water quality, whether they're competing with invasive species, what's going on in those really critical refugia habitats. Go ahead. Another really key thing, and I'm not going to get into estuaries too much either, but lagoon monitoring, as Mark pointed out, we don't really know how many fish there are and where they are. And one of the ways you can figure this out is by looking at what happens to the lagoons and how often they're connected to the ocean and what kind of condition they're in. And so one of the things that's been so exciting for the past 6 weeks, and in fact on my way up here today from Topanga, I stopped at every single creek mouth along the way to take pictures. And you can see that you have the closed condition, you have the almost there, we're not quite over the edge, and then connected fully to the ocean. And all of these dynamics interplay with the tides, with the moon, the lunar cycles, and all of them play a role in when the fish can get in or out of a given system. So we collect all kinds of data. And one of the things that is been really interesting to me is that in Northern California, where much of the methodology for studying steelhead trout and other salmonids was developed, they have all these lists of things that you're supposed to look for, none of which we have in Southern California. They just don't, we do not, large woody debris is a rarity here. You know, we have massive boulder undercuts, which are awesome habitat, serve similar purpose, but it's not large woody debris. So we had to kind of adjust the kind of data that we were collecting to what was really suitable for what was in the streams. So another of the things is that there's a lot of risks for these fish, and Mark discussed some of them, but the biggest one we face is when it's really hard to snorkel because there's no water. And if you're a fish, this really sucks. And this was the first year, this year, in all of our years of monitoring, where we actually had to go in and move fish because the pools that they were stuck in were drying down, pools that had never dried down since I've been monitoring. I've been monitoring the creeks since 1990. I've only been monitoring specifically the fish since 2001. We've never seen these reaches dry down. And so this was really a pretty impressive year in terms of what happened. And this is a really difficult situation for fish. And it's one of the things that's really important for us to understand those dynamics better, because these fish are the most resilient genetic base of steelhead. They are the ones who can tolerate these crazy conditions and these warm temperatures. If we lose Southern California genetic diversity, what's going to happen as climate shifts and it gets warmer and these droughts persist over longer periods of time? We have hotter days over all our months of the year instead of just in the fall. These are the fish that are the ones that can handle it. These are the fish that can spread further north and keep the species going. So just to kind of emphasize what has changed and the importance of estuaries, this was a plein air painter in 1924, his drawing of Topanga Lagoon. Topanga Lagoon used to be almost 13 to 15 acres of beautiful habitat. And now we are down to less than 2 acres. We've got an 82-foot span box culvert bridge that constrains the creek, and we've got almost nothing left of that lagoon with very little habitat. So this life cycle monitoring station that Mark mentioned is the southernmost one in the whole state. I think there are like 20 in the state, somewhere, yeah, maybe not even that many. But we're the southernmost. And what this does is it tries to pull together all the tools of the trade so that we can really focus on and understand what's happening in a particular site. And so you can see that this is our watershed. It kind of looks like Africa. It's 18 square miles, and the fish can only get up to there. And the reason why that limit of anadromy exists is because we've got boulders the size of this room that got moved in the 1980 flood and created a pinch point that the fish can no longer get above. Prior to that 1980 flood, the fish were able to get all the way up much further in the watershed. Next. So the tools that we use are mark recapture with electrofishing. We do single pass because this is an endangered species. The idea is to catch the fish we can, not necessarily to fish to depletion because we don't want to hurt anybody. We've tagged over 900 individuals since 2008. Go ahead. And then we put this antenna, and it's really hard to see, But if you look, you can see this little green hose here. This is part of a wire that goes underneath all those rocks. It's anchored into the sediment, and we've got 2 loops. And so as the fish swims either downstream or upstream, it passes the loops in sequence, and we can tell which direction it's traveling. And because it's tagged, and these tags are called passive integrative transponders, they're kind of like the barcodes at the grocery store. So we're like scanning the fish as they swim by the antenna. The problem is keeping the antenna in the water. We've had so many flash floods associated with these big storms so far. We just rebuilt it for the 3rd time. Got it in yesterday. And now, since 2012, we've had this handy-dandy, very spiffy, $80,000 underwater ultrasound camera. But what's cool about this is that if a tagged fish swims past the camera, and it's moving either going downstream, about 20 meters later, it hits the antenna. And so we have the image of the fish in the video. It's a live video continuously recording, and then we have the tag information from where it hits the antenna. And that lets us say, oh, well, this is Joe, and Joe used to live in, river kilometer 2.4, and it liked that pool. It stayed there for 4 years, and now it's gone, headed out to the ocean. So we get to be able to pull together all the pieces of the story of each individual fish. Next. And another complementary tool that we use, but which we have not been able to use this year at all, because it's been just so flashy, the storms that just blows this thing right out of the water, literally, is a weir trap. And it will catch fish that are going downstream, or it'll catch fish that are coming upstream. So it works in both ways. Sad to say, not so much action. Go ahead. So, what have we learned with all this effort that we've been putting in, with volunteers standing out in the middle? I should say that the camera, these are all taken, when the sun comes out, but these actually get deployed when it's pouring rain. And the fish tend to move mostly in the night. So most of our work is standing in the rain in the middle of the night, out looking at fish. So go ahead. So the snorkel surveys. This gives us monthly abundance and distribution. Go ahead. And what we found out is that it's really, really variable. It's variable over space and it's variable over time. But what's also pretty interesting is that there are some consistent refugia pools that we've been able to identify where the fish are constantly staying, and it's the same individual fish. And because it's been so dry for the past 4 years, we've actually really gotten to know these fish because they haven't been able to go anywhere. So every month we drop in and say hello. Just to kind of give you an idea, though, of the numbers that we're talking about here, they are really low. So the estimate that National Marine Fisheries put out when it listed the species was that there were 500 anadromous adults left between San Luis Obispo, the Santa Maria River, and the Mexican border. When we did a survey in 2014 where we polled everybody who was doing research, everybody who'd been paying attention to fish, from 1994 to 2014, we could document 147 adults total, and 50 of those were observed in 2008. So we're talking really, really, really low numbers of these fish. And we're, smolts, 10. We're talking 4 anadromous adults in Malibu, almost none in Topanga or Arroyo Sequite. So when Mark was pointing out that we want multiple redundancies, right? We want populations in each of these streams, we're really getting down to the pinch point here. And this is a critically, critically endangered species. Next. And this just kind of tells the story in one quick thing. So the orange is Malibu, and you can see that we had anadromous adults that spawned in Malibu in 2008. We got 3,000 young of the year, and very, very few of them survived to grow up. And this is when you get to the start of the drought in 2012, the numbers are just really, really low. As of last month, Malibu, Topanga, Arroyo Sequite, total of 36 fish, total. So this just kind of gives you a sense of the size class of fish. And what I just want you to take away from this is that, you know, we do get pulses of recruitment, and these fish do grow up into size classes, but the numbers are small. That's Topanga. Malibu's even worse. And the reason why Malibu is even worse, despite the fact that it's better habitat, it's more habitat, is that there's more competition from invasive species. In Malibu, we've got somewhere around 20 invasive species that compete directly with the steelhead and eat the young of the year. So, you know, they're really, really having a rough go of it in Malibu right now. Yeah. In addition to the snorkel surveys, we want to see if the fish are building any nests, if they're reproducing. Remember Mark's thing where it was productivity? You got to know how many nests are being made and how many eggs are being laid, how many young of the year are coming out. And as you can see, those numbers are not really very, very high. And so we're really having you know, once again, these fish are having a rough go of it in Southern California. In all of the years of our trapping, we have not been able to deploy the trap since 2011 because the water levels have not been conducive. But in that time, we only caught 45 smolts heading out. That's a very, you know, it's kind of a deceptive number. I'm sure there were more than that. We can only put the traps in when the flow is just at a particular level, and many of the smolts are moving when the flow is at a higher level than that, so we're missing them. But not so many fish. Go ahead. And this is just to kind of give you a sense of size of these fish. They're all in the 6 to 8 inch range, more or less, up to maybe 10 inches. And they're beautiful. We've done this pit tagging. As you can see, you just kind of we have to catch the fish. We anesthetize it. We insert the tag into its stomach and seal it back up again, and then wake it back up and put it right back. It's like being abducted by aliens. The genetics that Mark pointed out, because we've had over 900 individuals that we've captured, we've passed on that information to National Marine Fisheries Tissue Lab up in Santa Cruz, and Dr. Carlos Garza has been doing a lot of work on that. What we learned from our Topanga fish is that while there was at one point in time some hatchery influence, the majority of our fish are wild fish, and some of them have genetic ties as far north as Nacimiento. That's you know, up above Paso Robles, just to give you some idea of the distances these fish will stray and travel. So a key piece of the puzzle is figuring out what the habitat's doing and how much is available and how do we characterize this and document it. Go ahead. So we take not only the measurements of the pool size and area, but we also look at the temperatures in the pools to see how they change over time. And what's really interesting, these are the minimum temperatures. The maximum temperatures in Topanga Creek very rarely get into the critical thermal range for steelhead. Because Topanga has been groundwater fed, it really does sustain a fairly cool water temperature profile, cool enough to keep the fish going. Go ahead. I'm not going to get too much into growth analysis. I just thought it would be kind of fun for you to see how you take all this information of the size of the fish you see and the size of the fish that are in each different pool and track them over time as they grow and age. And some of our fish have actually been in Topanga Creek for 6 years now. And so, you know, they've stayed long enough that we've actually gotten to see quite a bit of their growth. Food. Food is critical. These bugs are amazingly important. If you don't have food for the fish, nobody's going to grow. One of the things that's been the most really interesting of the drought is to see how the food availability has shifted. where we used to have a dominant amount of benthic macroinvertebrates that were typically aquatic. Now what we're seeing is more terrestrial. So the bugs that are dropping from the trees that are alongside the creek are creating more food for the fish than the actual growth inside of the bugs in the stream. And one of the reasons for that is because we sadly now have invasive red swamp crayfish. These guys are native to Louisiana, southeastern United States. They have been used as bait forever and a day. And in Topanga Creek, the guy who introduced them just didn't want to kill the bait he had left over, so he just dumped them in the creek. And our fourth graders did a bang-up job of really keeping that population under control for a long time. And then we had the 2005 flood, and that dispersed them all through the whole creek. And now, in the drought, they were just taking over. And all the areas where the crayfish were, we were finding no tadpoles, we were finding very few benthic macroinvertebrates, we were finding really difficult time and space for the fish. One of the cool things is to try to figure out how all these species fit together. And this is a complicated web of life that's in the stream. And this is probably a very simplified version of that. And you can see that steelhead play a really key role, not only as a major dominant predator, but also as a key driver of how processes and these trophic levels are working in the creek. And it's a really important thing to keep all the pieces together and going. So as Mark pointed out, all of our efforts to keep steelhead going have the added benefit of keeping, they're like an umbrella species. They keep everybody else going as well. So just to end with some inspiration, because I think part of what we're trying to get you guys to get on board with is to really support all of these efforts to restore fish passage, to restore the lagoons, to create and reconnect the habitat these fish need in as best way we possibly can. And so this is what Topanga Lagoon looked like in it was actually 1916. So this was before Pacific Coast Highway was put in. Next photo is right after Pacific Coast Highway was put in. Here's the lagoon. That's the original Pacific Coast Highway bridge that spanned the entire lagoon, not just this little itty-bitty part. And the original road went up and behind the lagoon. It went back behind it. Go ahead. And State Parks now owns all of Topanga Lagoon property. We started trying to come up with a lagoon restoration plan that we got Caltrans to sign on to in 2004, and it took until this year for State Parks to kind of get on board. So these programs of restoration are really a labor of love over a long period of time, and it takes a tremendous amount of persistence. But what we'd love to see is a restored lagoon that provides self-sustaining functionality and gives these fish a better chance as we go forward. We'll see how that goes. But to show one that actually has been implemented and that recently worked is Arroyo Siquite. This is in Leo Carrillo State Park, right on the Ventura, LA County border. And the limit of anadromy, as far as the fish can get, is usually this culvert that's underneath the road of Mulholland Highway. But this year, for the first time in years, the fish were able to get above that. And the reason they were is because there was a number of restoration actions that took place along the way. So here's the lagoon, not much of a lagoon, right? Go ahead. And this is what it normally looks like. Pretty unexciting, and if you're a fish, not so good. That's what it started to look like this year with the flow. And I mean, look at that. That's just spectacular. It was up through my thighs walking through there. It was so cool. Go ahead. And it began to really pond, and there was all this eddy habitats, so there was resting places. It is still really a pretty good place. This is that culvert, but look at it. It's got flow. This is the first time it's had flow. It was up to my knees in that culvert. And it was really amazing to see that there was enough of a jump pool in the scour below. The fish could definitely get up and through, and they could go further up. And in fact, what we found was that because this lower in-stream crossing, this used to be a road. You know, Mark showed one in the Santa Clara. This was Arroyo Siquits. Well, what they did next was they took it out and they put in a bridge. Look at that. Isn't that an amazing difference there? Go ahead. And that was the result. This is the one single steelhead trout that we've seen so far this year in the Santa Monica Bay. To my knowledge, there have been a grand total of three anadromous adults observed so far. So this is like a rare, this is like, you know, gold. And what's amazing is this fish had its head stuck in the rock, and it was kind of like, well, if I can't see you, you can't see me. And so it allowed us to get right up and swim right up to it. And we were able to get a photo of the whole fish. That flashlight is 8 inches long, so that gives you some sense of scale. That was a 20-inch fish, and there's its face peeking out on the other side. So these fish are the eternal, if you build it, they will come. And it's up to us to be able to come up with the political will and all of the energy that it takes to figure out how to make these things happen and make it happen in our lifetime and do it in as soon enough time that we still have some fish left to do this for. So there's still a lot of work to be done, and getting involved with cow trout and Friends of the Sespe and Keep Sespe Wild and all of these amazing organizations you guys have here is really critical, because it doesn't happen unless everyone gets involved. It just doesn't. So with that, I'll finish. Any questions?
Ethan.
Thank you. All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you staying this late on a Monday to check this out. I'll try to keep it interesting and not linger. But yeah, so I work for an environmental consulting firm, and we contract to a variety of different entities. And a number of the partners on the Santa Clara Estuary are people that we work with as well. So we've worked in the upper watershed, and we work down in the estuary through a variety of different partners. And we are part of the Steelhead Coalition, which kind of gives us, you know, entree into a lot of these different areas. So you can go next. What I'm going to talk about today is the Santa Clara River estuary. And the way that I'm going to try to frame the discussion is first by talking about how, maybe you've driven across the Harbor Boulevard up here and looked down at this estuary and thought, geez, I wonder what's in there, what lives in there, how could steelhead use that estuary, what's possible out there in terms of enhancement, and what are the constraints? And that's what I kind of want to touch on. If we can go next. And a lot of what I'm going to kind of draw on is research that we've been doing throughout the state on steelhead populations, looking at how the environment affects the steelhead and what factors can actually change the ability of those fish to recover. And I'm going to kind of draw on a number of these different other areas as analogs for how we can think about the Santa Clara estuary, and then circle back to the Santa Clara River estuary. So next. So this is a great image from the recovery plan from David Boughton came up with, and Mark showed it earlier. And so it's a very diverse life history. And what I'm really focusing on is this middle part here, which is the estuary. So any adult out in the ocean that wants to go back to freshwater has to go through the estuary. So there's certain implications of that. And then any smolts that are produced have to go out through the estuary to get to the ocean. So there's just a basic migration issue. But then also, there's a number of these different life histories where you have growing and actually living, residing within that estuary as a key part of their life history. The next. So really within this, there's these two kind of basic physical components here. One is the sandbar dynamics, how that sandbar forms and when it breaches. So when the sandbar forms, then of course the essentially fresh water, which can be warm and it can be a little bit higher in dissolved oxygen and lower salinity, is going to build up and provide rearing habitat in here for juveniles that come down the river and rear in here. So they can, that's one way it functions, or they could actually get stuck in there if the water gets too hot and there's not enough food. You can consider it either favorable or unfavorable. And then when that bar breaks through, of course, that's when either juveniles can leave and go to the ocean as smolts and adults can get back up. So we'll kind of touch on these different dynamics. So starting with migration, of course, the sandbar is here, right? And the adults can't get up to spawn until that bar breaks. Now, what you want is, ideally, this is near Santa Cruz and San Gregorio Creek, a really kind of typical bar-built estuary system. This bar is going to break through every year when the first rains hit. Let's say late October, early November, it's going to rain in the upper watershed. It's an unregulated watershed, no dams or anything blocking the flow. The flow breaks the bar open. That's after a long summer. And that's a great time for any adults that are in the ocean to go right up that river, because the rain is when, of course, the creek is swelling, right? The creek is coming up. It's a great time, so the timing works out great. Steelhead get in there. So this same exact estuary, if it breaks through, because there's some people who like to go out there and dig, people don't like to walk across the lagoon, so they artificially breach the lagoon at this particular spot. And if that happens in the summer, it does nothing for the adults, right? The bar breaches through, drains the estuary, but the adults can't use that to get up because the creek isn't coming up simultaneous with that. It doesn't do them any good. So these more like Santa Cruz County and further north, you have this really typical system where the bar is going to break through in the winter. Every year it's going to happen, be open for most of the year. So go forward. So in contrast, on our part of the coast down here, we get these bars that can build up and stay closed for years. So this is the Santa Maria River. It broke through in 2010, and I don't know, Mark, I didn't see it break again until this year. So 7 years, the Santa Maria River was closed off, meaning any juveniles that were in the upper watershed couldn't get to the ocean, and any adults that were in there couldn't get up the Santa Maria River. Well, there's great spawning habitat in the Siskiyou and the Kiama. It's a steelhead stream, but we've looked at this in some detail in the Santa Maria River. This is essentially natural periodicity for this river, to only have a bar that breaks and provides migratory access every 5 to 10 years. Okay, so and that's not atypical for this part of the coast. So there are some exceptions, and those are important exceptions. One is the Big Sur River. The way that the river comes out, where it enters the lagoon, it like hits this bedrock, and so it kind of scours along that bedrock. And this estuary, in modern history, like at least for like the last 100, 150 years, doesn't build a bar, doesn't have a bar built system. I mean, even during this drought, there were times when it was closed off for a couple of weeks, but essentially adults always have access to the Big Sur River, and smolts always have a path out. And you also see that even in some small streams, like in Montana de Oro, if you guys ever go up there. Islay Creek, tiny little thing, but just the way it comes out against that bedrock doesn't close off. And then of course, like rivers that are tributaries to like Morro Bay, for example, there's some of those that, because it doesn't have a sandbar system, so it has continual access. Those are important streams. So that's one thing, is just when the bar is forming and when it's breaching is key for migratory access, and there's some implications for that. And then the second thing is that this is like in the summer, the kind of typical process is, at least during the summer, a bar is going to build up and form this, what's essentially freshwater, mostly freshwater lagoon. And within that, you're going to have, you have water temperature, dissolved oxygen, salinity, all these things. So fish are poikiothermic, right? Like whatever temperature the water is the temperature that the fish is internally. Like they don't regulate their internal body temperature, and they can't regulate that. So if it's really warm, their metabolism speeds up, which is fine if you have a lot of food to eat. In fact, if you have a lot of food to eat, you get really big. And if it gets really cold, then they get really cold, which is fine. It means they're going to grow less, and they can probably tolerate that. But the temperature increase is critical 26, 27 degrees Celsius can nearly kill a fish unless it's really feeding during that time. And if it also, especially if it has some ability to have temperature recovery, like at night it can go into some cooler water, or if it can dive into a deep pool. So what the water quality is and what these different parameters are within the lagoon is really critical to whether or not this is a hospitable environment for juvenile steelhead that end up in here, or if it's just going to kill them. And what you kind of would like is this is the top of, this is San Gran Gregorio Creek, and that's the top there, and that's a little bit of fresh water coming in there, which means that if conditions get really poor in this particular estuary, steelhead will swim out of that. They'll swim upriver a little bit and get into, maybe they'll get some cooler water, maybe they'll get something that's less saline, maybe the dissolved oxygen will be a little bit higher, and then they can actually go back down in here and feed a bunch and kind of stay in that wedge. But if there's not a connection between the river and the lagoon, then that can be not so great. The other thing is, this can be a really great environment, but if, I don't want to say it, but I'll say it, but if surfers come along and dig it out, then and breach it, or bird watchers, then of course it just drains it out during the summer, which is not naturally when this lagoon would be draining. There's no environmental driver for it to breach during the summer other than humans with shovels. So next. So I'm going to show a little bit of data because it's just so cool. But up in Scott Creek near Santa Cruz, Morgan Hayes and Sean Hayes and Morgan Bond have been doing a lot of work on looking at how fish actually live within these lagoons. And these are marking and tracking the actual size of fish, okay, that are either coming from upstream. So these are fish entering the ocean from the river, who lived in the river. And then these are fish that have actually reared in the lagoon. And the basic takeaway is that the fish that are rearing in the lagoon have much higher growth rates and are just much bigger. So if you go to the next slide, it's just really, so these are fish rearing in the estuary, really high growth rates, upstream, not so much. It's not like there's anything wrong with having a life history. This is going back to the spinning, right? Different life histories. It's not there's anything wrong with having a life history where you live up in a creek all your life and then head to the ocean. But if you're one of those fish that has a life history where you head 3 or 4 months earlier and end up in that lagoon, you're going to grow at much higher rates. The next. So the implication of that is that I'll make sure this is clear. So this is the size distribution, okay, of all the fish that are coming out of this watershed. And then that's in the dashed bars. And then in the black bars, this is the size distribution of fish that are rearing in the lagoon, okay? Much bigger, right? But here's where it gets really cool. These gray bars, this is the size of fish leaving that estuary and going to the ocean that did come back as adults, that came back as adults, that went through the whole ocean cycle and came back. So what it's basically saying is, if you're like smaller than 150 millimeters, there's like a bunch of those fish, doesn't even matter. They're not going to come back as adults. They're just feeding seagulls, right? It makes you feel really good that there's a bunch of these fish. But if you want to have fish that go out and come back as adult steelhead, then you've got to be sending them out as bigger fish. And that's fish, and in this system, that's the fish that grew in the estuary. And so we talk about like resiliency to disturbance, like resiliency to wildfire and resiliency to climate change. Like this lagoon life history is resiliency to upstream disturbance. So in this particular system, all these small fish, a lot of that's legacy timber effects. It was a timber-dominated system. Well, you're starting to hammer that upper watershed. Well, luckily we have this intact, nearly intact, mostly functioning estuary that's making up for that. Those fish end up in the estuary and they're really growing, and we're getting adults that come back. So there's also physical habitat within the estuary. This is the Carmel Lagoon, closed bar in the summer. You can see it looks like a desert, right, along the edges. Well, what's happening in this system is really interesting. First of all, when the bar is open, you have striped bass from the delta, the Bay Delta, get in here. And striped bass, if there's any anglers here, striped bass, great sport fish. they just nail the steelhead. I'm talking about the steelhead juveniles that get in here. Striped bass, voracious predator. And in this system, when the bar's blocked off and it starts to pool up and the water gets deep, the juvenile steelhead, they want to go into that deep pool water, right? Because they can get cool water and they can feed. And that's where the striped bass just nail them. So the juvenile steelhead go out into the middle of these deep pools and the striped bass nail them. And then the bar breaks through and the striped bass leave and the water gets shallower. And so now the fish are in shallow water and they get nailed by birds, like massive avian predation. So what we're trying to do in this system is introduce physical habitat structure to provide cover for juvenile steelhead rearing, both when the water's deep and when the water is shallow. So Candace, if you go next. So in this system, we've designed a bunch of these. It'd take a little bit to kind of focus on it, but basically we have big logs with boulders and root wads, physical habitat structure, and we're putting them in specific locations within this lagoon. If you go next. And the basic idea is this is different. It's a fluctuating system, right? It's going really deep and really shallow. And so we're setting up these structures in a way that as the water fills up, the fish can use that habitat to follow it up, or follow it essentially down, actually, to the deeper water. And then when the water is shallow, then they can use the shallow water habitat so cover from birds in the shallow water and cover from striped bass in the deeper water. So now kind of bringing that back. So estuaries can be a really key part of steelhead life history. They can provide resilience to other stressors like climate change, timber, any number of any stressors in the watershed. And there's opportunities to improve that habitat. So now we're going to kind of pull it back and see what we've got. So this is just noting where the estuary is in the Santa Clara River down here, just south of Ventura. And this is basically what it looks like. A couple of the key things to note: we have this big sandbar built system, right? And the sandbar, of course, is going to be blocking all access for juveniles leaving or adults coming out. So we'll touch on that. And then this is where the wastewater treatment plant is discharging essentially fresh water through the outfall channel. And so this particular estuary is not, during the summer, is not connected to the river upstream, but yet has quite a bit of water from that discharge. And then on the other side is McGrath State Park. So this is just a really complicated, messy slide. It's a way of saying that the first thing we've been looking at here is just the breach dynamics and how often adults can get up and juveniles can get out. And so we've looked at what the flows are like. We've talked to the city of Ventura. They record what the bar condition is every single day, and they've been doing that for years. And we're looking at just all the flow patterns, modeling how much water is coming into this estuary and how much is leaving, and looking at it over a long period of time. And then starting to look at these, when is the bar breaching? And this is just basically the water, right, fills up into the estuary. You have a big full estuary, and then it breaches. And what you hope is that breach is happening during a rainfall event and not from somebody out there with a shovel artificially breaching it. So you can go next. And basically, so this is basically this is like what a breach looks like when the river's really cranking and it pulls through like that. And then it actually becomes kind of this river where hopefully there's enough water coming down the river, adults can go up. And what we're seeing is that for the most part in the system, the bar this is the amount of time it's actually open. It's open for most of the winter in most years. So it's usually closed during the summer and it's usually open during the winter. And that's a breach cycle that is very compatible with adults getting up the Santa Clara River in the winter and smolts getting out in the spring. If you just go back, there is periods of time during droughts when it's closing off for periods of time, which is basically natural. And then there's also this unseasonal breaching, which is going to breach it in the summer, which is definitely an issue in this system, which I could talk a little bit more about. So then the other thing is, so basically the basic function of the bar breaking through is pretty good. And so we've also looked at just what the habitat is like for fish to rear in here and what that water quality is like and is it suitable. And so we've extensively looked, recording every 15 minutes, 24 hours of the day for months, and like over a couple year period to really look at what the water quality is like in this system at variety of depths. If you go next. And basically what we're seeing is that the water in here is pretty warm, and bar breaks off bar closes in the summer, and the water gets pretty warm in there, but there's a ton of food. So the basic water quality, it's borderline, but it's suitable for steelhead to rear out here. Problem is that although it looks like it's connected up there, it's not. So if conditions were to go into that critical zone, under the current conditions during the summer, steelhead couldn't get out. But the conditions in here are pretty good. If this bar is breached during the summer with like an unseasonable breach, which was done this last summer, people did that. I won't get into that exactly. I won't point fingers, but I know who it was. But if the bar is breached in the summer, then there's just no option for rearing in the summer, of course. So next, the actual physical structure and the morphology of the lagoon right now is being affected by the fact that we have a state park here, McGrath State Park. So when this bar builds off in the summer and is surrounded by a lot of suitable habitat, maybe you guys have seen this, but it's just flooding this campground. So right now there's an incompatibility between people camping and what would otherwise be suitable habitat. And then there's also levees up here and a bridge system. So there's a number of constraints on this lagoon right now. But with Toyo Foundation, Cal Trout, and others are State Coastal Conservancy, the numbers are working on plans, really specific plans of how these different interests could be managed and how the morphology of the estuary could be improved, taking into account the habitat rearing quality, the flows from the water treatment facility, and the breach dynamics. And you can kind of see that this is what it kind of looks like now, but that was 2009, it's even more so. But it's a pretty low gradient system down here, and a lot of that sediment that's coming out is kind of forming this delta down here, and under existing conditions, it makes kind of this shallow, flat estuary. There's not these big pockets and deep, more complex habitat, and that's what could be addressed with more physical restoration and addressing some of these constraints on the morphology. We've also looked at just what the aquatic biota, like what other fish are in this estuary and how that's, and what this is us with a seine here, and we've seined all over this estuary in all different seasons looking at what's out there. And we're seeing a really high abundance of invasive species. There are like native mullet out there, but there's sunfish, mosquito fish, fathead minnows, silver sides, carp next. And then really the African clawed frog are just a terrible, awful frog that eat all kinds of stuff that are out there. But we also do have pipefish out there and goby. And we have these pole seines out there. We don't have a permit to capture steelhead in the estuary, so we know that there are some out there, but we aren't sampling for them at this time. So we can't really address that specifically. If you go. And all these things interact. So this is just, I won't get into it too much, but when the bar forms off and you get this big freshwater pool, and then you're in the middle of a drought and it never breaks through, then a lot of these invasive species just build up these huge biomass of these invasive species. And conversely, when you have periods of time when that bar is breaking through and it's going completely riverine, it just flushes all those invasive species out, and it has more of a saline period. And species like tidewater goby are really well adapted to that. And then these other species like African clawed frogs and the silver sides, they're not as well adapted to that. So the invasive species are not as well adapted to that natural disturbance of the bar breaking through and going to that complete just flushing event. So this is just looking at real quick. These are the native species in red, just total native species. There was a lot more of them when we had higher breach frequency that's shown here. More recently during the drought, we had very few breaches that were occurring. And some of the breaches were not even complete breaches, and because of people digging them out. And during that time, we had this huge abundance of these non-native species, and we've had a big reduction in the native species that are out there. The good news is it's completely open right now. So I think probably by the fall, hopefully we'll see a little rebound in the tidewater goby and see a lot less of the African clod frog and green sunfish out there. So that's kind of the story on estuaries in general and kind of some of the stuff that we're looking at in the Santa Clara River estuary. Anyone has questions?